Hello, everyone. Welcome to D&I One-on-One Understanding Pay Equity. I'm Jina Etienne. I'm the host of this program, and I am a certified diversity executive and a CPA. I actually was in practice for over 26 years. Today, I'm a D&I consultant. I do training and coaching, speaking, and I get to host this amazing program and speak to amazing people like my guest today, Norma Márquez-Barahona. So Norma is the co-founder and brain behind speakTu. speakTu is a tool that provides workforce insight analytics to support social scoring in ESG and pay equity. The platform was born out of a connection she made between an attendee at a DEI presentation she was making. He was inspired by that presentation and the discussion she was having on pay equity, and the rest, as they say, is history. She's so passionate about this topic, and so Norma, I'm really excited. Thank you so much for joining me today.
And thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this important conversation, right? So thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
So maybe we can start with the basics. Can you tell us all, especially, this is an introductory level webinar series. And so if we make the assumption that our attendees today don't have a lot of experience with pay equity, or maybe they haven't heard it talked about in their organizations, can you give us a little background and understanding? What are we talking about? What is pay equity?
Absolutely. So pay equity is the concept of compensating employees who have similar roles or functions with the same compatible wage, right? Regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, or any other status. So it is simply, a little bit more complex than what we think, but what we want to make sure is that we understand and how to eliminate those biases when it comes to pay compensation across different demographics within a corporation.
So I've heard people talking about pay equity as if somehow it's favoring women. Okay, so first of all, pay equity isn't just gender, but we're focusing our conversation today on gender because that's often the topic that comes up. And so what do you say to those who say, she isn't getting paid more than she's worth? And I don't mean that in terms of value, but her skills, her background, her experiences, we make fair offers. So how can we be crying that it's pay equity now? Especially for people, I'll add this, that have worked in an organization, not new hires, but somebody who's been here for 5 years.
And oftentimes women are already, if you look at the statistics across pay equity, women are getting paid 83 cents to the dollar a white male makes in the same role. The inequality is actually increased when it comes to women of color. When you look at African Americans in the same role than a white male, they actually make 64 cents to the dollar. And Latinas actually make 57 cents to the same dollar. So the inequalities are actually even wider when it comes to women of color in the same roles. So yeah, there's a discussion out there, and it's not so much about the experience that the women have, is how are they being brought up into the organization, and are they compensated equally? And so that is the analysis that needs to take place.
Well, before we go any further, let's go ahead and launch, Autumn, our very first polling question. So just to see who's familiar with this concept.
Sure. Poll number 1 is up and running. As a reminder, we'll have 4 during the presentation, and you need to answer at least 3 to earn full credit. I'll leave each open for a minute to make sure everyone has an opportunity to vote.
So while that is open, I just want to recap. So what I'm understanding is this is about looking at the disparities in pay. Today we're talking primarily about gender, but there are a lot of disparities for different groups. And you're not looking just at pay, but you're looking at how women are being compensated as they move up in the organization. So am I so far following?
Yes, you are. An interesting fact is that we know women, if they feel particularly connected to the company, they oftentimes stay longer. And so what ends up happening, their salaries never match the market, right? Even though the experience and the skills might increase, their salary is not in alignment with the
Right.
market. And
All
so
right. I was just going to close this poll down here for you and share those results. So 54% said yes, 34% somewhat, 11% no. Back to you.
All right. So those who said yes, drop your questions in the Q&A. I know people not only ask questions, but they share their experiences, and I'm happy to share them as we go along in the presentation. So, sorry, Norma, you were talking about women stay longer, and it was as a result the disparity grows.
yes, and one of the factors that we did an analysis for a company, and what we realized or what we saw is that women that have been in the company for a longer period of time, but they also got a promotion. For women of color, we saw a 1.5% increase in salaries, where women that were not necessarily of color, their salary increases were 30%. So it's important for companies to drive that culture and to look at the analysis to see where they fared, not just with gender, but also ethnicity within the same gender.
So when you say analysis, is this really simple? I go into my organization's HR database, I pull up the pay, and then I say, how much are the men making? How much are the women making? I see the gap. Let's give every woman a raise, and we solve the problem. Is it that simple, or do we need to be looking at more than that?
We need to be looking at more than that. I think that in order to perform a pay equity, you gotta look at salary bands, but then you have to look at similar roles, right? So in an administrative assistance to a secretary, it's similar roles. And what does the compensation look like, right, within that organization? So it's a little bit more of an in-depth analysis, but at first glance, it will give you whether there is a gap based on your own salary bands within the organization, and then how does that pair against the market that you're currently trying to attract into your organization as well, right? Because it's one of those things where you would really have to look beyond just your organization in order to attract the talent that you want.
Yeah, as usual, it's not just about recruiting, but it's also about retention. And that has come up a lot in many of the different episodes of this program, where the issue used to be solely about either recruiting or retention, and today we know it's both. So Dara asked, my biggest question is how to learn about actual pay at the workplace so that you can do a comparison. So I'm feeding this to you because this is some of what your company does, but it's on point with the conversation right now.
You know, it's interesting because in previous generations, I think that, excuse me, in previous generations, that salary conversation was not allowed in corporate America. And I think with the new generations, they are not afraid to disclose how much they're making. And I had this conversation with someone that said, oh, you know, people get paid what they are worth and they shouldn't be compensated differently. And I said, let me ask you a question. How long have you been with the organization? And he said 15 years. I said, I guarantee you, the person that is coming into your team tomorrow is probably making a lot more money than you are, because what happens is you stay within that company for a very long time and your salary increases are based on those merit increases, right? Not necessarily the market. And so there's a lot of tools out there, you know, speakTu being one of them, but there's a lot of tools out there where you can actually look at the market research and see where you pair out with compensation and the experience that you have. But internally within your own company, I think it's a conversation that is valid with HR, given that you have the skills and the experience, right? To say, you know, I think I need to be in alignment with what my skills are for this particular role. Or, you know, an opportunity to say, you know, this is where employees can actually take advantage of those conversations, because then maybe it means that within your own workforce, you can have upper mobility within your employees, right? Maybe, you know, you outgrow your role. Maybe we'll look at, you know, what experience and skills you have gained that we might be able to put in another role where we might be able to compensate you very differently, but we still have you, right? It costs a lot to recruit that talent, but why not retain it? And why not retain it at the level of skill level that they are performing?
Right. I know that the cost of turnover, depending on what data you look at, is anywhere from 1.5 to 2 times someone's salary. So simple example, if somebody's making $100,000, it's going to cost you between $150,000 and $200,000 to replace that person. And as you just said, then the new hire might be expecting even higher salaries than the person who left. So, I mean, these are very real dollars we're talking about saving. It's something that
Absolutely.
go
Go
ahead,
ahead.
sorry.
No, go ahead.
It's funny, the delay, right? So something that you just said got me thinking. I know for me, coming into a role, you negotiate hard for salary because you know or you don't know what those raises are going to be. But then I never really thought about those pay disparities over time and what that compares to people coming in today. So when you're talking about pay equity, does this mean a woman coming in today can be making more than a woman who was there 15 years ago for 15 years? Are we worried about compensation differences for women, just looking at women? Does it ever get that nuanced, or does it always come down to women versus men?
You know, not necessarily. I've seen industries in which women actually make a little bit more than men, right? And so it was based on the industry that you are. But overall, in other industries, I think that it's always women making less than men. And an example, you know, that I always like to show, if I may, is that we had a software developer position, you know, that my colleague was working on. And when they went to present it to the woman, what is your salary range? And she said $90,000. And from a company perspective, you're thinking I'm saving dollars, right? Because my salary band might be $140,000 for this particular role. And when they went and asked the male, he said $120,000. When they tested them, she tested a level 3 software developer and he was a level 2. And they went back and they said, we want to offer you $140,000. And her response was, why me?
Well, yeah, that has to do with some of the confidence gap issues and some of the other imposter syndrome challenges that women disproportionately experience.
But what we're seeing, go ahead.
Well, if he's a level 3 and she's a level 2 at their current levels, then it sounded like their pay differences were aligned with their level differences.
Actually, she was actually a level 3 and he was a level 2, and he was asking for more money. He was asking for $30,000 more than she was asking at a level 3.
I misunderstood. Okay. So I can see how that's going to be a challenge. I can get that. So
Yes.
One of the things I've heard is that if we do a pay equity analysis, when you know better, you have to do better. Part of the resistance then of doing a pay equity analysis is, I don't know how to close that gap. I can't afford to automatically just hand out these amounts of money and then start paying at a higher rate. That's going to blow the budget, so to speak. So how do you address that? Are there any suggestions for that?
You know, and that's critical, right? Because now you did the analysis, you identified some gaps, and now you have either a risk or you have an opportunity to make sure that you close those gaps. And so a lot of the employees might see as a, you know, is this a discrimination, right? We're seeing this specifically only happening to women and women of color. Is this where we might be subject to a discrimination, you know, lawsuit or a you know, potential risk? And then you can't cut wages. You can't go back and say, well, the employees are getting paid more, I'm gonna cut your wage in order to give it to somebody else. That is just not doable. But what you can do is say, you know what, if we were to close the gap, could we make a commitment within our organization that says, you know what, in the next 3 years, our commitment is to close the gap with some of the individuals that we identify that perhaps are below that really band. And how do we go about it, right? Could we increase it by 5% increments? So, and then you can start budgeting into that, right? And so imagine if you were to really promote pay transparency within your organization and have those conversations and say, we're not where we need to be, but we're definitely making an attempt to close and identify those gaps so that we can be, you know, treat you with equitably within our organization. So those are the conversations that need to happen. How much are we willing to give to retain the employees? And then, you know, and that, you know, can that translate into also getting more referrals, more people wanting to come to the organization because they feel that now I can refer somebody because they're really intentional about how they go about communicating with me.
So I'm working with clients have you found that pay transparency actually helps? Because I can also see concerns by employers that if I reveal what this gap is, there's going to be a run for the door for the people who aren't getting paid if there isn't an instant fix.
And again, that's where the risk comes, right? With the as a leader, if you say there's an identified potential gap, is how do you manage those conversations? And whether you look at skills or you look at are there any opportunities within the organization for us to move that individual, or simply just offer them a little bit more as an incentive to stay. And what we've seen is, you know, a lot of what I saw in one company is that individuals learned how to get that extra dollars. So when they were in critical positions, they will leave. They knew the salary that they were offering for, because a lot of the states now require that you post the salary bands for some of those jobs. So they knew exactly how much the salary band was. So they will leave. And then the company had a struggle finding those candidates to replace the individual that left. 6 months later, they come back and Gina, they're making twice as much money.
So many things are flooding through my head. So the first thing I thought about, I'm going to park it, but I want to say it out loud, is when I see job descriptions on LinkedIn, it always says pay unavailable, except in states where it's required. So I want to talk about those state requirements. The other thing I think about is when people are looking at their pay in their organization, negotiating then for a raise, this pay transparency is helpful. So I'm just sharing an observation. I don't know if that's bringing up anything else for you, but I know for me, if I was working in an organization and I just found out I was making $25,000 less and I feel equally qualified, that, I don't know, does it put me at a disadvantage when I go in and get evaluations and then ask for a raise? Because if I don't get the raise, what do I do? Do I leave? So are there tips? I'm a manager now, and I have somebody that I have to do this evaluation on. What can I do to prepare?
And that is so critical, right? Because you as a business operation leader, you need to know exactly what the value of that individual is within your organization. And if they were to leave, what is the knowledge that you lose by that individual leaving? Is that worth the risk? I think you talked about, them leaving with the knowledge and what is the cost of recruiting that individual. And if the individual leaves and it leaves the gap for 9 months, what is the impact on the business, right? So there's always budget items, and then you can always go to leaders and do it. And I tell you, the conversations that I had in the past have been there, right? I don't think I'm compensated fairly, and here's what I've been doing. And so senior leaders take it. And sometimes it might not be that they don't want to, is that they just did not see it.
Yeah.
They didn't know. They didn't know that
transparent to anybody is what you're saying.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the conversations probably are not happening, or they're just not looking at it. And then you've been there for so long that they just assume you're okay because you're doing the work.
All right, Autumn, let's see how many of our attendees work in an organization that have conducted a pay equity audit.
All right, poll number 2 is up and running. We've had some great questions and comments coming in there for you, Jina. I flagged them for you.
I'm looking at them, and we might need to spend a little time here in the Q&A when we come back to this. When the poll question ends, though, before we jump into the questions, I do want you to talk, Norma, so I'm going to tee this up. There are more and more states that are requiring pay equity. And so is there a way, I know the answer because it's part of your platform, but how can an organization, especially larger organizations, do this? And are small companies required to do it? All right, so I'm going to hold that thought because I think the poll is literally about to close.
It is a couple more seconds here. Again, this was poll number 2 out of 4, closing in 3, 2, and 1. Sharing those results. 48% led with not sure, followed by 31% with no, 17% yes, and 5% currently in progress.
I actually find that encouraging. I was expecting to see more, fewer yeses. So this is encouraging. So back to my question though, and then we got to do some of these Q&As. The requirements are starting to pop up in states. Is that expected to be a trend? How similar are they? How do I keep up with all of them as an organization? And as a small business, am I required to?
So, I think we have to go back to the federal laws governing the pay equity that were first enacted in the early 1960s, right? And those are the Equal Pay Act of 1963, which says that this law states that the men and women employed at the same business should receive equal pay for equal work, right? So there is already a federal law out there. And then the second one is Title VII of the Civil Rights of 1964. This is Title VII offers broader protections to Equal Pay Act that prohibits pay discrimination based on just gender, but also race, color, religion, and national origin. So they are out there in the federal level. I think we're seeing in the local, we're seeing in some of the states like Colorado and New York, where you gotta disclose your salary bands every time you post a job. When you look at California, California has a Fair Pay Act or report as well that is mandated for any company that has 100 or more employees in the state of California. You gotta report, submit that report every year. And that one right there, that report has a minimal and a median wage average for those particular roles. So yes, we're starting to see that. And I think that the other thing that's happening is there are organizations like ours that offer a fair pay certificate or certification where we look at your data. We analyze the data and we'll tell you where there might be some discrepancies and what actions you need to take in order to drive that impact. So that itself gives you a little bit of moral sense of we're on the right track, or we identify the gaps, and then what do we need to do to close those gaps in order to make sure that our employees feel safe and they feel their value within our organization.
So those pay bands then at the state level have to be adjusted for the regional economies. And so the pay bands in New York City are going to be different than the pay bands in St. Louis. And that transparency then are these reports open to the public?
They are. And one of the things that is interesting is that, I looked at a couple of jobs that were posted in New York and some of them have the salary band 0 to 2 million.
That's not helpful.
It's not necessarily to the position, but it was to like a general, right? It was more of a requirement that I need to fulfill. Let me just go ahead and put a range in there. So that's just not being transparent, right? So I encourage the companies to really be transparent in terms of those pay bands.
Speaking of which, I found this really cool tool, and it is on the census website. I should have included the actual link, and I did not, so I apologize. But if you want the link, I can send it. Just email me and I can send it. What I love about this tool is you can actually click on the map and find out what the wage gaps are and in your area. And this is really important to understand. And small firms and smaller organizations, it's hard to compete against the bigger companies. So understanding some of these gaps, number one, if you're in line with some of those bands, then maybe you can use that as a way to suggest to your prospective employees, we're actually competing with them on pay because now you have the data. The other thing is, if you know that if you have a sense of what your compensation is as it compares to the compensation of the bigger company, one of the things you can do then is differentiate yourself because of the benefits that you offer, for the culture that you have, for some of the flexibility and the opportunities that your organization offers. So just throwing that out there. All right, so many questions. Somebody said, let me see. If women were getting paid, okay, let me just put my glasses on. Let me stop pretending I can see. If women were getting paid less than men, who would hire a man instead of just hiring women? A company that would do this would have a competitive advantage in the marketplace. Have you ever seen that? That there's a shift then to hiring women and not adjusting salaries?
No, I've not.
It's very interesting that somebody would ask that question. But the good news is you haven't seen it. So, but I can see the logic in asking. So somebody says skills and experience are 2 factors. How about performance in the pay model?
Absolutely. And I think that that's part of the internal compensation, right? And how do you adjust that salary? And it's part of the KPIs. And a lot of the organizations take salary as part of the merit increase or the comp plan or bonuses. And we're talking about the baseline, right? And a lot of the companies actually lump sum everything. Oh, well, then we have a bonus, we have benefits and other stuff. But what we're talking about is, what does that baseline look like? And are you paying women and men differently?
So part of this pay equity evaluation or assessment, does it look at trends or does it just look at where we are right now? Or does it say, this woman and this man started year 1, now we move forward to year 5 and we can see what those rates are, because in theory, she went like this and he went like that. So is that part of the analysis, or do we just start with identifying where the gaps are?
We probably want to start with identifying where the gaps are. And so, and many times what I ask is that part of the hiring process where there might be a bias, right? Because then we have a issue in the recruiting process. Is there a policy, right, where women can only move into certain roles and not roles that are highly compensated? And what does that look like? And why is that happening? So looking at all those different things. And so I'm glad that you brought in this this slide, because when you look at ESG, and I'm sure many of you have heard of ESG and what that means, and the fact that the movement was created by 4 investors who are very intentional about responsible and social investment, right? What is the impact that your company is making on those communities? And if you look at the S, is a social responsibility that talks a little bit about pay equity. And when we talk about pay equity for the communities in which we live and work and operate, the difference between a woman making $10,000 more is that woman will be able to afford a home, a car, childcare, and maybe healthcare insurance, right? For $10,000 more. So, and we know that behind there's an economic power that is driven by women, because oftentimes women are the decision key makers in some of the households. Yeah. And so there's a huge impact to why women should be compensated fairly, and why it's important for organizations to look at that, because women also tend to stay longer with an organization if they feel that they belong and they are being looked at, as a true asset. So, and why is that important again? You want to prevent discrimination lawsuits. You want to comply with the equal pay regulations. You want to improve productivity and morale, and it really increases retention within your own workplace. And again, I'm going to go back to my point that I made earlier, is that if I'm happy where I'm at and my coworkers are happy, I'm more likely to recommend that place of employment to others, right? And attract top talent to the organization. So the recruitment cost that you talked about, it's probably less, right? Because now it comes from direct referrals.
Right. Actually, some of the data is telling us that the most reliable way and the most likely way to get a job these days isn't by looking it up on the web and seeing that there's a space or an opening and then just sending in my resume. It's actually who you know. And that by that I mean, can you get a referral from an employee into the organization?
Absolutely.
And nobody's going to refer somebody into an organization that they don't like, they don't trust, or they themselves are looking to leave. So, I mean, that's a really good point that you bring up. All right, so let me go back to the Q&A. So I see some questions are coming in here, and I think you've addressed them, but I do want to ask them to see if we can just sort of reinforce it or clarify. So one question says, what do you do if your top performing employees get upset with pay equity and leave?
That is a function where, as leaders, we need to have those conversations. And again, we might not be where we need to be, But having those conversations where we can say, you know what, again, we're looking at it, we're analyzing it, and we're taking steps. And sometimes that's all your employees need to hear, is that you acknowledge it, that you know that there's a gap and that you're working on it. And then ultimately having those honest conversations that lead to transparency and feeling that you hear me. I'm important to you. So we might not be there yet, but we'll get there. And I encourage my HR, professionals, if there's any on the call, is how do you look at your talent mobility within your organization, right? It's a great opportunity to say, you know what, we might not be able to offer them more salary within this particular function, but maybe we'll look at reassessing their skills, and maybe they are, maybe they belong over here where the compensation is a little bit more different. And I have had those conversations, in the past, being a leader, with one individual that I said, unfortunately, you've been here for 30 years and you already kind of matched the salary band, and at this point, you're only going to get a 1% salary increase. So I want to be honest with you. What do we want to do now? Where do you want to go? Is there any other areas within the organization that you might want to kind of conquer? Because I'm here to help you navigate through that. And so, pay equity is important because of the gaps that exist. But I think ultimately, once they in their organization, is how do you treat them and how do you create that talent retention and upper mobility of your own workforce?
I think another thing to consider, and I don't know if you've seen this, but I know I've anecdotally heard about this. My clients, I haven't heard about it specifically. But we know, or the data tells us, that millennials, and I hate to just sort of lump them in there because but generally speaking, our younger people coming into the workforce today, in their 20s and their 30s and their early 40s, are more passionate about mission and purpose than pay. And so maybe the transparency, even though it reveals gaps, the transparency is what creates stickiness, and not what appears to be secrecy around pay, especially as more organizations are requiring it. So more of an observation on my part, but I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that as well.
And you're absolutely right? They are all about social responsibility, but they will be the first ones to post if they're seeing inequalities within an organization. Can you afford the risk of having that brand visibility? And we know that have been organizations out there that have been have had civil lawsuits because of the pay inequalities. And imagine your company having to go through that, and then what is the damage to the brand?
Right, not just the company's brand in terms of products, but the employer brand.
Absolutely.
And that's a different brand, and I don't think many people think about the employer brand, but the employer brand is what says to me, this is a good company to work for. Good varies for all of us, but companies need to be thoughtful about that, because that is the first reason that people even look at your job description before even considering applying. So that's a really, really good point. Okay, so many questions. Actually, there are a couple I'm going to hold off on until we get to the third polling question. The federal government and unions often post pay bands. I'm curious if there's still a gap there. That's an interesting question.
It's interesting. I'm sure there is gaps everywhere. We were talking to a group in the military, even they themselves believe there's gaps within the military. And so I think that there's still a lot of conversations. And again, we're specifically looking at women and pay gap, but I think that there's still a lot of biases that take place when you hire an individual. There was one person that posted on social media, and it was like, I saved my company a lot of money because the person took the job for $60,000 less.
As if it's something to be proud of, instead of realizing that that person's been shortchanged as a result.
Absolutely. So now you think about, you bring in this individual. What if that individual comes in and leaves or doesn't come? And what if they go and post on social media that, you know what, they bragged about me taking $60,000 less, and as a female, would I feel comfortable working for this particular employer?
I tell you, social media has changed the game. let's see, does the pay equity study take into consideration levels of education, numbers of years of experience, etc.? So more than gender and how long I've worked at the organization, but my years of experience in this level, this job, or this role.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, when you talk about not just number of years of experience, you also look at how long has that employee have been with the company. And what we identify in many other studies is that you might have certain demographics, they come in and they're just gonna stay flat, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then at certain time during a career for certain titles, it spikes up and then it drops right after a year. So that should be a concern for an organization, right? Why are they leaving? When they get to that level of management, they're dropping after a year. So why are they leaving? And why aren't we retaining them? And why aren't we attracting more of that specific demographic? And so those are the type of studies that the tool provides, is that looking at really at the overall organization and then the makeup of from the diversity standpoint and where your employees are, right? Because you want to have that pulse. Talking about recruitment, you know, you want to bring the diversity of thought, because that generates more ideas, which means that you can have a bigger market share just by having those ideas. So having that data really helps you analyze where you are and where you want to be from a workforce standpoint.
So there are a couple of questions about this. So I want to go ahead and launch this third polling question. Are you aware of the enactments of new pay transparency legislation, both federal and state? And I'll say this because one of the questions is, who do we report this to? And there was another question. Let me find it. Must have cleared it off. So I apologize, but there was another question about reporting and the accountability if organizations are saying they're doing it, but they're not really, or they have the information, but they're not reporting it. So hopefully we can come back to those. I'm looking at the responses. We probably have about 15 more seconds.
Yes, poll number 3 is running.
There's so much to this. I think pay equity, a lot of people think of it solely as the differences in pay. But I think that hopefully they're starting to understand from our conversation today, this is really complicated and there are a lot of analytics that are behind this. Okay, so sorry, Autumn.
No worries, closing this one in 3, 2, and 1. I'll share those results. 66% led with no, 17% yes both, 11% yes state, 6% yes federal.
That's fantastic. So 66% no. So hopefully we've raised some awareness in today's session that these laws exist. So somebody asked, who do they report to? Does this mean, so there's the federal EEO1, which for those who don't know, organizations that are greater than 100 employees have to report their demographics and their diversity data on an annual basis to the federal government. Is that the same data you mentioned, the similar report in California? So
yes.
If we report to the federal government, can that just sort of pass to the different states, or how does this work?
So each state has their own, I know California has their own way of format in which it needs to be submitted. The federal level has the EEO1 report, which has to be submitted. And these are for publicly traded companies, right? And again, and it circles back to the ESG and how investors are scoring your organizations, and then ultimately looking at the SEC and how that proposed regulation, the ESG, kind of leads to investors feeling safe about the organization they're about to either do an investment with or buy. So it really helps them look at the risk associated with that specific corporation. We're starting to see this movement not just in the US, we're seeing it in Europe with the Pay Transparency Act that will be enacted in 2024. So this is something that is not just happening in the US, but it's happening across the globe. You got the SDG goals, Sustainability Development Goals from the UN. the UN. So, you got pay equity in there, you got gender equality. So there's a lot of things that are driven from a global perspective.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, you mentioned the disparity in income for men and women in the context of more money to women and the cascading or the domino effect it has in the economy. And it also speaks to disparities in other areas of discrimination in that UN report. There are a lot of different areas, including not just the local economies, but child hunger. I'm trying to
Human
think.
rights.
I think there are 17 goals in there, something like that, 16 to 17 goals, and so many of them are connected, but not as overtly so I'm glad you're spelling it out. So I want to jump here really quickly.
Can you hear me?
I'm sorry?
Are you able to hear me? I'm so sorry. The poll is still up. Are you able to pull your slide back up?
Oh, I thought, let me stop sharing and reshare because I have different slides. So hold on. Stop sharing.
Now I can pass you the control back.
Okay. Can you see it now?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, sorry about that. So I wanted to jump to your platform because now I'm exhausted at the idea of having to collect the data, perhaps one time. I mean, the data is the data. And now I have to format it for 17 different states and the federal government. So can I use your tool to submit to all of these, or at least collect the data formatted for all of these?
Absolutely. So our tool is, one of the approaches that we took with our tool is that we don't necessarily take personal identifiers into the data because we know that that's data privacy, and we don't want to have any risk mitigating with you having to put that data into the system. So it can be implemented with your payroll systems, or you can actually import a data sheet into the software, into the tool, and it will do the analysis, giving you visualization into where some of the areas and the data. But it would also put together the EO report for the state of California within seconds, the EO report for the federal government, another area in which we can help organizations easily look at, the report. And, one of the things that oftentimes we know data is as good as you have it. And sometimes we skipped whether we want to identify ourselves by gender or ethnicity. And so our tool will allow you to see where there might be some errors based on the data that is missing. But we also thought that it would be important for us to have a non-binary gendered representation. We're seeing a lot of the companies adopting some of that, data collections. So we want to make sure that individuals are being identified as they want to be identified. And this is for our LGBTQ community partners. So go ahead.
Well, no, I was going to say it's interesting because one of the concerns people have in providing some of this information is it really not identifiable information? And so often there's employees will trust a third-party source before they trust their employer for revealing this information, because that it's called PII, personally identifiable information. There are rules and requirements to be able to meet in order to say that you are compliant with those rules. And so I think that that's the other thing for people to think about, is that having these types of systems and tools in place can create trust and build trust. So I just want to then officially go to Q&A before we run out of time. Somebody mentioned, can you define woman? And I think it gets back to the point that you made. So does your pay equity systems account for different expressions? We know on the passport, there's male, female, and then there's an X. So we're starting to see government forms collect this information and employers collect this information. How does that affect pay equity? Is this a third category?
Yes, and absolutely right. And that is exactly what we did with the tool when we were developing. I wanted to give an opportunity to everyone to feel safe in terms of who they want to be identified by. And so we put the field female and male and non-binary. And to your point, we want to break down the pay equity by individuals who do not identify as female or male. And we also want to identify pay gaps for individuals that are in the disability side or veteran status, right? So those are, it's a little bit more detail, but with that, it's important to start looking at individuals and looking at data across, not just from a gender perspective or ethnicity, but also looking at other areas that might impact the risk for an organization or how they're compensating the employees. Because we know that, there could be factors in which people are compensated less than just because of whether it's in a physical disability or invisible or not visible disability. And so that's just for us to make sure that we bring awareness to that conversation.
I actually appreciate that, because the data tells us that people with visible disabilities are more likely to be unemployed or underpaid or underemployed. And so creating this transparency is important. A lot of the pay equity conversation is gender focused, but there are disparities based on race, age, background. So some people with a college degree versus without a college degree. And we're starting to see people eliminate the college degree requirement, but what is that doing in terms of pay if there are equal skills and backgrounds? So somebody asks, is equal work defined? Two people with the same tenure and experience may produce different results, more sales, more complete work, etc. How does this play into the determination of fair pay? Can these two individuals be paid differently and still be compliant with the equity model?
Absolutely. So what we're looking at is the titles, right? And titles are similar, but the experience might be different, right? And so sometimes there are people out there that says, well, I got 10 years of experience. Is it specifically to this functional area or not? And so that's where the analysis has to go in depth, right? We can't just assume, oh, well, you got 10 years of experience and she has 10 years of experience, so that you should be compensated differently. It's really looking at the experience that you have to perform that that function within the organization, right? So that's where it becomes a little bit more critical for us to really look at the data and dive into the data for us to better analyze it. So the important piece is, are we being intentional by looking at data? How often are we looking at data? Do we have a pulse check on our recruiting practices and whether there is any biases when we offer a salary? And and all those things, or our policies are not in alignment with making sure that individuals feel safe in the work environment to come up and say, you know what, I think I'm being compensated less than, right? So just having those conversations so that people can feel that they are being valued.
Somebody has a comment in here, but it's a follow-up. The comment was, audit was identifying duties and whether pay was in line and comparing pay of organization to other organizations. So that is a comment. I don't know what the question was that might have preceded that, but I wanted to share it. Another thing here, you mentioned you work in the same company for a while and the new hire will have the higher salary. If you want to stay with the same company and it's based on your current experiences and tenure and professional relationships, your market worth might be more than your current pay. What should you do to ensure you can deserve the higher pay without being frowned upon by your manager? And how do you check your market worth? And how often should you be discussing this with your manager? Lots of questions in that question.
Well, that's good. I think that the conversation, again, within your own department is, what have you also done to upskill yourself, right? If you're doing the same role, you might not be at the market value, but what have you done to make sure that you kind of gained access to a higher position and with that close the gap? So that conversation has to be ways. What have I done to get into a different role? What have I done to earn the higher pay? Oftentimes, I can tell you that individuals that stay with the company for a very long time and they don't seek that upper mobility, they're probably going to be left behind with the salary. There's a lot of tools out there for researching, and I'm not telling you just quit, right? Leave your company and come back. What I'm saying is, how do you upskill and how do you gain access to other opportunities within your company? Ultimately, that's what's going to make the difference for you. There's I heard somebody from HR say, when they offer you a job, it's because they really want you on the job, and oftentimes we take the first job offer, and it should not be the case. right? We should always be looking at market and where that salaries are, and for us to negotiate. And think that this is where I would love to empower women, right? Look at the salaries and don't take the first offer and negotiate, because I guarantee you there probably is a little bit more in the budget of HR for you to be compensated fairly. And so, go ahead.
I'll layer in a little bit of context there, and that is that the data also tells us that women wait until they qualify for the entire, like if the job lists 10 qualifications, they don't apply until they have the 10. Men will apply if they have 6. And men will get paid more even if they still don't have all the qualifications. A woman not only has all the qualifications, possibly more. So I just want to encourage women to question whether or not they are willing to put themselves out there and not wait until they have all 10, and then, to your point, negotiate. All right, let's see. 2 or 3 more minutes here. What can we knock out? 2 questions are left. Have you seen any cases of pay equity among overweight individuals? This is not considered a disability, but it is a visual difference. And I will say there's also a preference and a bias that is weight-based, and we know this. So have you seen that? Is that, I don't even know if that's something that somebody can do pay equity, because you can't put in somebody's weight in the system, but.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen it on the reports, because that is something that we don't necessarily track. But I can tell you that from a recruiting process, sometimes there are biases associated with that.
Yeah. So here's another one. Another category of discrimination that has been overlooked is that people who start life as orphans or who were raised in foster care have invisible disadvantages. Often discrimination has more to do with the economic situation in which the one was raised rather than gender or race. So Victoria, thank you. That's really just an observation. So I appreciate you sharing that. And then this one more comment: the women-men difference on applying for a job is based on one company study. I'm not sure about that, but thank you for that. I'm happy to go back and personally research that. So that's interesting. All right, so we've cleared out the question queue. If another question comes in, maybe we'll try to take it if we have time. We only have a few more minutes. So before we wrap up, I do want to invite everyone to join us. This is a bi-weekly webinar series. So 2 weeks from now, I'm going to be joined by Heather Schotten, and she'll be talking with us and help us unpack the understanding around the indigenous identity, culture. What does that mean? All the things that you want to ask, but you don't know what to say. You don't know if it's safe to say it, and why it's important for us to think about indigenous identities and understand those cultures in our D&I efforts and conversations. And I have here just a couple other sessions. These are all now. Heather's session is up for registration. I believe the session with Captain Lindsay is now available for registration. So I'd encourage everybody, if you're interested and you like these conversations, please join us. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to you. We'll do our 4th polling question here in a moment. Before we do that, or I'll say, let's open the polling question, Amber. Why do I keep calling you Amber? Autumn.
And that is okay. That's my second name.
I'm so sorry. And then while that is open, maybe do you have any final thoughts that you want to share with us, Norma, before we close out?
What I would suggest is, and you made a good point about, women don't apply for roles unless they meet all the qualifications. I would say go ahead and apply for them, but also make sure that you add, end results to your resume, right? Men do it, and women oftentimes don't do it. So make sure you add any accomplishments that you have. Unfortunately, there's a lot of tools out there that, not fortunately, but I guess in a good spirit, there's a lot of AI tools out there, and the resumes are being ranked based on the job descriptions that they and matching your resume. So make sure you kind of align yourself with some of those key descriptive of requirements for the job.
And a tip for everyone, go check your LinkedIn profile. Today there are a lot more things you can add. You can add skills, you can add volunteer positions, and I would encourage people to don't put the volunteer position as a job. Fill it in under the volunteer section, certifications, all of those things, because people will go to your profile. And I don't know if people know this, but you can download your profile as a resume. So build it out there. quick tip. I didn't even realize that until one day I was playing around and I did that. If you don't have a resume and you need something quick, you can create one from your LinkedIn profile, but you have to put everything in there.
Absolutely.
So
And don't take the first job offer.
don't take the first. That's a good one. The worst you can do is ask, right? Don't be afraid to ask.
Absolutely.
So no, I wasn't saying that men are better at writing resumes and applying for jobs. So I hope that somebody didn't get that impression that just came in through the Q&A. But it's certainly for everyone to think about is, reviewing your resume and comparing your salary, looking for those salary pay bands and using that to ask for the pay that you're worth. All right, so I can see the polling question is almost done, and I'm so happy for those who said that they've learned something new. Oh, almost half. For those who said they got CPE, you're welcome. I'm glad you were able to join us, and I hope there was something in there that piqued your curiosity. So Norma, thank you. Thank you for joining us, and I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, and anyone that wants to connect with me, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Be happy to have the conversations with you going.
That wraps us up. Autumn, not Amber. So I'll hand it back to close us out.